Hi, this is your host Sapin Bhartia and welcome to TFR Insights. Today our guest is once again Julian Fischer, CEO of anynines. Julian, it's great to have you on the show.
Absolutely great to be back. Thank you.
We are in 2021 finally. If you look at the evolution of anynines itself, you started with Cloud Foundry, but now you're also catering to Kubernetes. And if you look at Kubernetes or cloud space, those technologies have been through the hype cycle. Now people are using them in production, and that's when the real problem starts. It's all shiny and good, but when you actually bring it in production, that is when you see all those problems. So if you look at anynines, you're also building a platform which is bringing both Kubernetes and cloud native technologies together. You're working on managed services, you're working on data services. So can you talk about, first of all, if we look at the whole evolution of anynines, what are you going to focus on in this year, where we can also talk about these platforms that you're building?
Well, I think it's obvious that Kubernetes is a game changer. I mean, we have been talking in several sessions about how does Kubernetes affect, for example, Cloud Foundry. And I think today it's very obvious that the impact of Kubernetes is much more than it's just changing Cloud Foundry's container scheduler, which happened in Cloud Foundry several times already. So one of the observations, I think we've mentioned that in our last conversation, was that there's a trend towards Cloud Foundry environments based on virtual machines. That these environments can be very big. It's I would say one of the strengths of Cloud Foundry to provide this CF push experience, even for very very large environments where there are thousands of virtual machines. So we happen to operate several of them, and I can say that they are very solid. And at that scale, I would still assume that the virtual machine based version of Cloud Foundry is the best choice. At the same time, we can see that if you look at, for example, at our anynines platform, which wraps up Cloud Foundry based on virtual machines, data service automation based on virtual machines, and Kubernetes on demand, which is also currently still based on virtual machines. So these virtual machine-based modules of the anynines platform will continue to exist, and we bring additional modules that will base on Kubernetes. So in that development, we've been looking into environments in customer environments, and we wanted to learn how they will use Kubernetes and what are their problems with existing Cloud Foundry environments, and how could they benefit from Kubernetes, and how could they possibly even encounter new problems that haven't been there before. And so today we are talking, and there's a bit of learning from customer accounts that we can share. And one of the things is that it seems as current Cloud Foundry on Kubernetes projects, there are two different implementations that are to be mentioned. That is Cloud Foundry for Kubernetes, and that's kubecf. Well, they're basically a packaging a Cloud Foundry and bring it on a Kubernetes. They have different, let's say, ways to do that. So that would be interesting to talk about. But at the same time, we can also see that there are limitations to these solutions at the moment that somehow create the appearance that they are not yet ready to compete with the classical Cloud Foundry stack. For example, for the larger Cloud Foundry environments, I've been saying that it is too early to move everything towards a new stack at this point. Although we have running environments already, we feel comfortable with the existing stack, especially if there are thousands of virtual machines. That's basically things that we have experience with, and it just works like charm. Now, I don't think that necessarily it's a design goal to just take those big environments and place them on Kubernetes. There are currently drafts in the Cloud Foundry community. I think we've mentioned that in our last conversation too, that suggests that maybe you'll have multiple Kubernetes clusters where the Kubernetes cluster itself has a similar role compared to the isolation segments in the classic Cloud Foundry stack. So that maybe a Cloud Foundry control plane will talk to multiple Kubernetes clusters, or even you could have multiple Cloud Foundry control planes. Now, that's we talked about that already. But if you just let that assumption sink in for a second, you will see that if currently there are, let's say, two environments, a production environment and a staging environment. Often customers do have several regions, so that you'll have to multiply that against the number of regions. Then you will see that there will be more Kubernetes clusters than there have been, more Kubernetes environments than there have been Cloud Foundry environments. These environments with multiple Kubernetes clusters will have more heterogeneity. And if you think, for example, what this means that if you have one Kubernetes cluster, you also have a networking challenge to ensure that this Kubernetes cluster may talk to another Kubernetes cluster in terms of routing, as both Kubernetes clusters usually come with their own networking, with their own network and own IP address range. So you have to somehow make them interoperable. Now, if they are interoperable, what if you have two tenants on your platform that do not have a trust relationship among themselves and among each other? So you have to create isolation. And this is exactly where there's a certain complexity being introduced in those platform environments. If there are more Kubernetes clusters, some of them may be specialized where, let's say, data services are running, where some others may have Cloud Foundry. Some may have both, but that generates a lot of heterogeneity. And what we can see, it also generates a lot of operational friction. So that would be our general observation. And we're doing a lot of research at the moment to develop best practices here and find recurring patterns to be automated. At the same time, we can also observe that Kubernetes itself, for example, the exposure of infrastructure credentials, if a Kubernetes cluster is configured to talk to a storage server, for example, can be rather problematic if the trust relationship to the user of the cluster is not substantial enough to allow this stakeholder accessing those credentials. So there's a little bit of homework on the Kubernetes side, or at least on the side of these infrastructure plugins, which is interesting, and also currently being researched in customer projects.
If I'm not wrong, the first data service is also under development. Can you give us the state of that project?
In the classic anynines data services, we have multiple data services that are all based and developed and automated using what we call the anynines data service framework. So when we thought about what is the best way to bring this exact user experience to the Kubernetes ecosystem. Now, the Kubernetes ecosystem is a bit different from Cloud Foundry. So as I mentioned, we are working on Cloud Foundry for Kubernetes. So we already have Kubernetes environments, Kubernetes-based Cloud Foundry environments up and running. Now, if you have such a Cloud Foundry environment on Kubernetes, you also want to have data service automation that will integrate with Cloud Foundry. So we are talking about service brokers again. You need a service broker to consume that data service. And there, I don't think you will care so much whether there's a container or a virtual machine started. As long as noisy neighborhood isn't your primary problem, I don't think a software developer will care. So far, you could assume that just taking your service broker and integrated with Cloud Foundry for based on Kubernetes will work, and it will. If you're using BOSH-based virtual machines and you combine a Kubernetes-based Cloud Foundry with your existing data service, that's perfectly possible. And in some cases, or maybe even a lot of cases currently, that's a good thing to do because these products are very mature. However, the next thought that we have was if we are addressing the broader Kubernetes audience, then there may also be people who do not have Cloud Foundry, and maybe they do not want Cloud Foundry. For example, because their environments are not that big and the CF push experience is not their primary desire, but they have a stronger desire for the flexibility that ships with Kubernetes. For example, wrapping up a legacy application that requires persistent volumes. It's easier to get hosted in a deployment based on, or a stateful set based on Kubernetes than you could do that with Cloud Foundry. And what if you want to provide data service to these folks as well? Then the service broker, as a primary means of integration, requires to have a Kubernetes extension, which is called the service catalog. It doesn't seem to be a very popular project, so apparently the operator concept has a better traction now being in the CNCF, and where the idea is not to make the Open Service Broker API your primary citizen, but to use Kubernetes custom resource definitions, which is basically telling the Kubernetes API how to store object specifications. Like you can specify a service instance according to such a CRD, which makes up, let's say, your Postgres instance. And then you have a controller who will take that specification and talk to the Kubernetes API and translating your Postgres specification into specifications of lower abstractions, and will create a service, a secret, and maybe a stateful set. So that user experience based on operators will allow the creation of CRDs and operators and controllers that will together comprise an operator that, for example, will allow you to create Postgres instances talking to the Kubernetes API directly. And our best guess is that this will be the primary citizen of the future, and that the service broker integration will then be the other way around, so that the service broker in the end will delegate the heavy lifting of the data service automation to the operator. And we believe that at this point, it is still very important to look at several data servers at the same time to have a homogeneous structure of these CRDs, because otherwise the service broker integration will be, let's say, more effort, and user experience for both platform operator and application developers will be decreased, and more operational friction will be observed. So again, to avoid that problem, we are going to create a new data service framework that will leverage the operator SDK as well. And we decided to start with Postgres because it's one of the data services that has challenges because, for example, there's no cluster manager that does leader election. You all have to add that. And so Postgres is a good service to start with. So the point, and coming back to your answer, if you start thinking about Postgres itself, well, there are Postgres operators. There's, for example, one by Zalando. Zalando, in turn, has a Kubernetes and container images called Spilio, which basically wraps the Petroni project. So we've been looking into these products, and they are very good. It's nothing to say against it. But if you think about building a platform where you want to have several data servers sitting right next to each other, and you may have to reproduce these platform environments several times, you really need to have full control over the user experience for both platform operator and application developers. Logs and metrics, backups and restoring backups, they all should, behave in a standardized way. So in order to get there, we dissect that existing operator and strip away anything that could come into our way. So for anynines Postgres, for example, we decided to go with Petroni and reuse part of Spilio for now, while we have a feeling that even this will have to be replaced in the long term. Not sure how we could come together with talking to the Zalando team themselves. We haven't done that yet. But what I'm saying is the user experience of building a data service experience based on Kubernetes, it will also require those questions beyond a single data service. But you need to start one implementation to find out whether your working hypotheses can be validated. So not to tell you too much here, but so far this looks good. We're making progress. First product demo will be available at the end of the first quarter for Postgres. Currently, we are working at the user stories of creating service instances. Next will be backup and restore. And then we are looking into collecting logs and collecting metrics and bring that and integrate that together with the rest of the platform. So it's kind of exciting at the moment because there's so many moving parts at the same time. On one side, you have Cloud Foundry being put on Kubernetes, and you have Kubernetes itself, which still is being discussed. What's the right abstraction for it? Are you using the cluster API, or you still want to use a BOSH-based provisioning? And then you have the data service and the framework that's being newly developed. So we are trying to leverage as much of the CNCF projects as possible, as they seem to be stable and well adopted. So that's let's say the building blocks we are using to create that new version of the anynines platform.
When I listen to you explain data service, I am also thinking about the recent CNCF report. And one thing is clear when we look at CNCF landscape, that yes, it's a very crowded, very busy space. There are so many logos you see there. But it also means there is a lot of complexity there. So there's a rise of managed services. Do you also have that in pipeline? Because when I look at anynines, what I look at is you're helping customers. So the problem with managed services is that they are opinionated, so sometimes customers want flexibility. They want to be able to move when you build platforms. So can you talk about where is managed services in your pipeline, depending on how much you can share at this point?
We've always been a comprehensive solution provider in the sense that we not only ship software modules that can be consumed by the enterprise, but we also provide operations for them. With our Cloud Foundry and VM-based anynines platform, customers can tell us to operate their whole and entire stack for them. That's what we usually do. We have a second offering where customers, we call that operations support, where customers operate these environments themselves, but we help them to take the releases and test them in their environments, prepare the configuration. So they'll perform all the tasks, but we help them to get that organized and obviously provide them support if something goes wrong. Now that with Kubernetes is upcoming, the situation is a bit different because you don't have those homogeneous large environments anymore. It becomes more complicated to provide remote operations, because you don't exactly know how the client wants this more modular platform be put together. So currently, we continue to have the remote operation services also for Kubernetes-based environments, but we'll add a new service which we call anynines managed services for application workloads. And this is basically taking remote management one step further. While our existing operations, they operate platforms and platform extensions. So, for example, you can look at a Prometheus from an application developer standpoint. It would be a data service. But from the platform operator perspective, it's an extension to the platform because it's an integral part that will be used to, let's say, see if the metrics are according to the desired SLA. So these extensions, or let's say a key cloak for authentication purposes, like those things, they are usually part of the environments and we have remote operations for them. But especially with Kubernetes, and clients who are in a transition to adopt cloud native software development, they sometimes also have a desire where they have an application system that they want to have up and running, but the application developers are so under pressure that it is hard for them to implement the you build it, you run it principle that was once proposed by Werner Vogels. And they are looking for somebody who will take care of their Kubernetes clusters, including their application workloads. So this is something that we started to do with selected clients because there was such a demand, and people were asking us whether we could render such services.
One thing that is happening in the cloud native world, actually, if you look at cloud or open source in general, what open source has done is it has democratized a lot of technologies where people can very easily, use them. But open source is still day one problem. For day two, you still need somebody who knows, or you have to have teams. That is the problem that cloud solves. You don't even have to worry about day two. You just go to the cloud, of course, if you're not managing yourself, and you can start consuming it. But that is also affecting open source licensing a bit. We have seen a lot of companies, they are trying to keep up, and they are trying to find solution for that problem that cloud is kind of creating in licensing. Because with cloud, if you look at SFS, you don't have to redistribute any code. So you are not obligated like that. So we have seen a lot of companies, they are changing their licenses, which, depending on how you look at the discussion, may even say that, hey, that code is no longer open source now because, it's not OSI compliant or whatever it is. So how, like Elasticsearch is a very good example recently. MongoDB, earlier we saw that. Other companies have also done that. So how does that affect anynines? Because you are leveraging, you are contributing to a lot of open source technology. You work in an open source space.
That's a very good question that kept us busy in the past years, talking to clients a lot. In fact, MongoDB was one of the first companies who changed from an open source license to a license that they call the server-side license, the SSPL. I think they try to get it accredited or confirmed that it is an open source license. It created a huge discussions with high emotions that were not very positive about that move. So they've drawn back that proposal to get that SSPL branded as a open source license. These companies, they then, let's say there are two sides of the discussion. The one perspective on this is there are companies who invest a lot of money into building open source, sharing their software with a community of people who can volunteer, contribute to the software, make changes, apply the software to their own organizations without being paid for, without having to pay for it. So there are no license fees. You can just download open source software, change it, use it. And people love that. There's a kind of love story over the last years with open source. And that's wonderful. And I really, truly love that. And we are leveraging open source since our company exists. Now, there's also an observation, and that observation is that it is not all happy and joyful in the open source world, but there are legitimate interests of vendors to protect their own businesses. Let's say they've onboarded funding from investors who usually have a particular time frame to get their money back. So they have, let's say, a time frame in which they have to get, profits or revenue back. And then cloud providers of various sizes, let's say large ones, maybe the ones that caused that shift in thinking, they just took these services and offered them on their platforms without contributing back to the original vendors. Now, there's business interests involved, so there's money to be made. And, let's say there are moral aspects to that story, but there are also well, let's say, monetary interest to be respected. So these discussions often have a kind of moral, subtle or moral subtone to them, but it is also about the money behind the scenes. And that makes sense. So these vendors say, well, we contribute and we invest in software. We need to make money to fund all that software development. And we would like to protect a certain part of our business. In the SSPL, MongoDB, for example, has decided to own the managed offering towards a public crowd. So if you are a public platform and you want to offer MongoDB as a service to third-party developers, you'd have to purchase a license. And that is, well, let's say, restricting the freedom on how to use a software that was up to this point open source. Now, one could say MongoDB is a particular case because they have been using the HEPL with a strong copyleft from early days. They've always said, we want the HEPL to interpret it in a way that it still, leaves it in a way that they can protect their own interests. So that's kind of one thing. Now, with Elasticsearch, a second vendor has gone this route and tries to, or changes from an open source license to that dual license model. And for their open source license, Elasticsearch was using Apache 2. So the Apache 2 license is a rather, let's say, it doesn't have a strong copyleft, or it doesn't have a copyleft at all. I don't think so, and it's rather liberal. And for example, for me, this is even a stronger change, because from a project that has committed to Apache 2 once, change back their open source part into SSPL is introducing a abrupt disruption for certain customers. And we have seen customers in our customer base being affected by that too. And to in their perspective, without having my own position here, but in their perspective, they were in a transition to adapt open source in large organizations. That's not easy to achieve, right? They slowly build trust into open source projects, and then they suddenly see faced with the necessity to negotiate with a vendor, because otherwise they'd be violating a new software, which at some point, I don't think it's blackmail, but at least I heard that word in conversations. People felt blackmailed to talk to these vendors. And that's not a very good way to start a conversation, I suppose. So I'm not really sure which side is now better. The ones who want to protect the investment, still do a lot in open source, and just feel as if they protect their legitimate business interests against others who do not want to contribute back to the community? Or are there companies who have used the advantage of open source for their marketing purposes, collecting a critical mass of users to then monetize hard on these users by pushing their own commercial products? As I said, I don't have a final opinion about this. All I can say is that the controversial nature of these discussions show that it's at least not as easy to say which one of the different perspectives is right. There's legitimate interest and criticism, I think, on both sides of that discussion. For anynines customers, we inform our clients when they engage with, for example, the anynines data services, and tell them that there are services being shipped with SSPL licenses, and that they need to check with their own lawyers whether they want to offer that to their developers. And basically, do they have third-party developers or not, is usually the question to be answered, which is most of the cases rather simple. And most of our clients don't have that problem and therefore aren't affected by that license change. But still, it's a hot topic to discuss, and so there are different perspectives with legitimate arguments, I would assume. By the way, our own products, our own automation, that is more like the gluing open source software together. We've never open sourced a large swath of our own frameworks because we also saw problems in releasing the software and protecting our commercial interests. And we had a model to the proprietary part of Elasticsearch and Elastic products, where we share the source code with our clients, where they can sign contributors agreements so that they can openly look at the software, but we keep the intellectual property, and it's not an open source license because we are self-funded. We don't have investors, and therefore we also need to protect our money streams that fund the developers who will then take care of the product. So I would say developing an open source product is something that people may do from different motivations, but having a solid runway to establish a technology, push it into the market, and then find a way to monetize it is something you really need to have patience and the corresponding runway organized. So otherwise, you may run out of luck at some point.
And if you look at the old days of back in Sun Microsystems or MySQL, a lot of products were licensed under dual licensing. If we go back to look at the free software open source word Qt, that's why KD and GNOME, this is what we are seeing today is nothing new. Because if you look at the Free Software Foundation, and then OSI came into existence to kind of commercialize the open source, because free software was not a word that companies want to use or associate it with their product. But sometimes when you look at the licenses, sometimes it depends on how you interpret it. It looks like more or less like you want to give more rights to the users than the creator of the project. At times it appears, but the fact remains, it can be good for hobby projects, or it can be also important to release all codes for the project where my life or infrastructure or government policies depend on. That code should be open source, like a lot of things, like my pacemaker. People should be able to audit that code. But then it also depends that when you're looking at a business model, as you rightly said, then you do have to commercialize it to make your service product or even that open source code sustainable, and to strike that balance is really critical. So yes, a lot of companies, they do a mix of it. I don't know not to name any company, but even some of the biggest open source companies, they are not fully open source. They can talk about open source as much as they want, but their open source sometimes is that after the product is released, they dump the code there. There is no community that is built. I don't want to name anybody, but that is what it is. But the thing is, they have a kind.
That's an excellent.
They have
point.
a mind share. Yes,
that's an excellent.
They have
point.
a mind share where they talk about open source. But if you look deeply, no, it's not open source in the pure terms. And also, there is a lot of vendor lock-in also with open source. So it's very easy to criticize smaller companies. Hey, you are changing, but we have to survive too.
Look, that's a very good point, or at least you gave me that association. When talking about open source, we talked about Cloud Foundry with its Cloud Foundry Foundation. Under the umbrella of the Linux Foundation, we can also talk about the Cloud Native Computing Foundation and all these interesting Kubernetes projects. Now, if you look at a particular open source project, and as a company, you want to decide on whether you want to engage with the open source version of that software, is there a strategy on how you could decide whether this software is good or has potential risks? And I would say there's a good chance that you may run into a problem someday if you're looking into a single vendor open source project, which is a project that has one main contributor and uses open source as leverage to get technology adoption and therefore leverage their marketing. Because if you have a single organization, this single organization with all the intellectual property can make those license transitions rather easily. if you, for example, have a software that's owned by a consortium of people, where you at least have to get a majority vote to get such a license change across, this is not as likely to happen. And this is something that raised awareness among our clients a lot. Is I had discussions with, for example, procurement people or people who are working in legal departments, and they said, these changes of the SSPL from licenses to SSPL or anything alike, it's not the SSPL alone, and it's not to blame any vendor here for protecting their interests. So this is not blaming. This is just observing what happens in the organizations. It's like these legal departments, they said, look, if we choose to adopt a certain technology, and we engage with a commercial vendor, they come with a price model. We know what the price model is. We have, our legal frameworks. We can predict how much cost we have. Now we adopt an open source technology owned by a single vendor, and we predict our costs, our spendings, let's say for 3 years. Some companies, they do things like that. So they predict their cost for 3 years. Now, in year number 2, there's a change in license, and they are forced to sit together and cut a budget somewhere else to get a single vendor their license costs. Now, if you look into that, like how, as an entrepreneur, like how do you feel if you make a customer do that because of what you changed in your license? Like, this is not a good conversation you will be having. This is a very hostile environment of a conversation that you are likely to face. And I would rather not have meetings like that, to be honest. So that's for my personal purpose. I don't think this is the way I would like to have a customer relationship to be open. So even beyond that, there's harm done because organizations that have just begun to adopt open source and sharing their own open source, they now have a feeling that, oh, maybe open source isn't the right thing because there's that risk involved, so that you have to pull back being open source, moving to other license models at some place. And who else will do that in the near future? So that creates uncertainty and this kind of state of awareness. Let's say that something bad is about to happen that erodes trust in adopting open source. However, and that's what I tell those legal departments then too, is don't get in the way. If your technology department wants a certain technology and adapt it, you can also check who owns that code. Because, for example, if a project is committed to the CNCF, I would assume that it's not that likely that people will do that 100-degree turn from purely open source to anything that restricts that, similar to the SSPL, because there's a foundation and people have given away their technology into the hands of a foundation for the purpose of having that technology adoption. Now, is that a guarantee? Maybe not, but I would assume that if a technology is owned and maintained by multiple vendors rather than one, where there's a true community, then there's a true open source project, and the single vendor technology that is open source for marketing purposes mostly, and then there's a sudden change in movement. I would say that this is a different category of open source projects where there might be more awareness in the future for companies adopting these technologies. So I'm not sure these companies have done a great favor for the open core business model, where you have that open source part and that commercial part of the software. They may have harmed adoption of open core based products when there's a single vendor present. At least those are observations I have made. It could be not a representative number of samples, I have to admit that, but at least I've been through some very emotional conversations, and sometimes I got even between the data service vendor and the client, and I have to admit that was one of the emotionally most stressful conversations I had, and I didn't really enjoy that.
No, I fully agree with you. And this is not, it's a kind of, it becomes a toxic discussion very quickly. Julian, I appreciate your time today. Thank you for talking to me today, not only about where anynines is heading with data services, managed services, and cloud native and Kubernetes, but also talking about this, how this license change is affecting companies, associations, and also business models. I look forward to talk to you again. Thank you.
And thank you very much, and see you next time.